Hi, I'm Mike Eaton. I'm a medical advisor for Rural Health West and have been for a few years. And for the last 15 or so years, I've been doing rural locums around WA, but also interstate in Queensland, Victoria, Northern Territory, and in South Australia. But mostly here in WA and ranging from the Kimberley through to the Great Southern. It's been a great experience. I've thoroughly enjoyed the variety that WA offers, both clinically and geographically and socially. And I've had a taster for the eastern states, but I really enjoy being here. It was a matter of course, really. The practice that I was in, I wanted to leave, and I left and began teaching and doing emergency work both in Bunbury and Busselton, and from there that extended into locum work in the Pilbara, in the hospital, and then into private practices and working as a GP, but nearly always with a hospital-based focus. And I spent 6 years working intermittently and regularly in Meekatharra, along with a team of 5 others, where we looked after the local town, including all its emergencies. And that was one of the richest and most satisfying experiences that I've had for a long time. I think the key is the variety. It's the endless change that you get when you move from one place to another. Not only does the social life change, the personalities are new and exciting to meet new people, but you've also got the clinical excitement and the challenges of dealing with sometimes sick people in very different locations that require much different interventions compared to another place. For example, working in Exmouth, where it's a long way to anywhere, or in Meekatharra, where it's equally a long way to anywhere, but the clinical demands are equally great in both. But geographically, you couldn't have a world of difference, where the desert country and around Meekatharra has its own beauty, whereas Exmouth has its own coastline and fishing challenges to go with it. So there's a variety both in the places and in the clinical work that it's attached to them. Currently, I've been helping out colleagues in the goldfields in their extremely well set up general practice, and in a small wheat belt town where I've been helping one of my former registrars, giving him cover while he has a short break. And again, going back to those towns is lovely because you know the clinic staff, you know the hospital staff, and quite often the patients remember and are happy to see you back. So it's fun. I think one of the major challenges is when you move to a town, there's a new environment. It's both a new clinic environment with its own individual ways of working and running, and it's also the geography of the town, what its social background is, what its social demographic is like, and then also its illness demographic, because different towns have their own patterns of illness, apart from the chronic ill health which we see across the whole of the population. But there are elements in each town which are individual. For example, in the wheat belt, you're dealing much more with farming communities who are much more intimately linked with the mood that flows from the environment and from their own climate. Whereas in Exmouth, you're dealing much more with the mood that's related to fishing and the pressures brought on by the increased tourism numbers, both on access to normal community facilities such as the supermarket, whereas normally you have 8 months of grace in Exmouth where you can wander into the supermarket without pressure. But that's all changed now, so that any visit to the supermarket is like visiting, Woolworths in Balcatta on a Saturday morning. It's not an easy exercise. So each town has its own challenges and its pleasures. I think the key thing is a good grounding in general practice, but also in the management of general practice, and that's the back of house affairs, to know what's needed to run a really good practice and how best to help the staff achieve that. I find that if you know the back of house or find out the back of house when you arrive, it makes your work in the clinic so much easier, because most of our problems are not really the clinical ones, it's the administrative and the environmental ones and the geographic things that come from how that clinic works in that town and how that town fits into the bigger state picture for retrievals, for specialist support, for colleague support, and also at the local level what happens in the hospital. So it's quite, they're the things I find most challenging in a new place, and I always make sure when I move somewhere for a locum that I find those things out before I start consulting. That way it's in the back of my mind before I get going. The clinical stuff is always interesting because you're meeting new people, and that in itself is a challenge. Particularly keeping to time is a challenge because I find I'd like to know the people that I'm helping, that I'm treating, and that just takes that little bit of extra time per consultation than otherwise. So I generally try and get the staff to allow me a little bit of latitude with the booking for the first few days, just to allow time for those interactions and that fact-finding to occur without putting pressure on the following patients and on myself and on the front desk staff, who then have to answer to everyone why we're running so late. So there's some things that I try and do early in a locum to allow more time to get to know the people that I'm looking after, not just their conditions. That helps to create a lovely clinical environment where it's much more interesting. And as William Osler said, I'd much rather know the patient whom has the disease than the disease that lives in the patient. And I find that exemplifies what the pleasure is in remote and other locum work. It's meeting new people and finding out what makes them tick, or in some cases what's making the tick mechanism go faulty. I think the first thing is to find out when you're going to be available and plan from there. Some places are climatically very uncomfortable, but that's made up for by a greater sense of community during those uncomfortable times. I'm thinking particularly of the Kimberley, where during the wet season the environment outside can be quite uncomfortable unless you thrive in the tropics. But the clinic and the community atmosphere at those times is much richer in the sense of social cohesion, joint suffering, joint awareness, escape from the heat is a perennial focus. That's the sort of thing I would take into account if you're susceptible to climate discomfort. But if you're well travelled and you're comfortable in many climates, then think about where the type of practice that you would like to work in. Do you prefer a smaller practice, or do you prefer to be part of a larger one? If you're part of a larger one, consider how much autonomy you will have within that practice to set your own consulting rate and your own choices within the consulting framework. If it's a smaller practice, that's much more easily negotiated. And that way your locum will become an enjoyable time rather than a trying one. So think about the size of the practice that you'd like to cover for. If it's a colleague that has asked you to work there, then by all means have that frank discussion about what it's like, what are the pros and cons, what do I need to look out for, all those sorts of things. And work through a recognised agency such as Rural Health West, where the focus is on supporting the person who's wanting the locum. Some locum companies, support companies, are fine and others are less fine, and that's what the message is that I've heard from different people. So think about employing a non-denominational, if you like, or a non-aligned locum provider who will be there for the sake of the locum recipient rather than for a commercial interest. When considering a locum, if you know the people that you're going to work for, just deal directly with them and set up your own payment parameters and booking parameters. And if you are uncomfortable doing that, well then contact Rural Health West, who can assist you and your locum requester with those administrative details, and that takes a lot of the work out of it for you, so that by the time you get to travel to your new town, then the bulk of the work has already been done. And all you have to do on arrival then is go and introduce yourself to the reception staff and enjoy the ride from there. It's always worth remembering that your presence as a locum is highly valued both by the clinic staff and by the patients that you're attending and looking after while your colleague is away. It's a very much appreciated time, and people are delighted when they know that you're coming back. And many times in those practices, you then become an extension of the usual staff and are welcomed for your contributions and your care for the people that are there. So there's a joy and a fun thing in both, in going back to a place that you've been before, where the relationship has been good, the administration has been good, and the payment has been on time.